In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a stranger lies dead in the vicarage, a dagger in his heart, and secrets swirling like mist. Who was Reginald Thorne, and what dark past drove someone to murder? Was it greed, revenge, or a desperate act of loyalty? Join Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a web of blackmail, poison, and hidden identities, where every villager hides a secret, and one wrong step could bury the truth forever. Will she catch the killer before the shadows strike again? In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, the brutal murder of reclusive newcomer Reginald Thorne in the vicarage study shatters the peace. Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming demeanour and razor-sharp mind, takes on the case, uncovering a trail of clues, a muddy footprint from the old mill, threatening letters in elegant script, a belladonna-stained glove, and a serpent-edged. As she navigates the village's gossip and hidden tensions, she discovers Thorne's past as Reginald Harcourt, a disgraced financier who ruined lives, including those of villagers like the Grimsbys and Miss Hartnell. Suspicions fall on Mrs. Lestrange, revealed as Eliza Warren, Thorne's former partner, Dr. Haydock, who supplied poison in a misguided attempt to scare Thorne, and Leonard, the vicar, protecting his wife Griselda from Thorne's blackmail. Each chapter peels back layers of deceit, with Miss Marple's trap revealing Dr. Haydock's role and Griselda's sighting of a woman in the garden pointing to the true killer Miss Chandler, driven by loyalty to protect Griselda from Thorne's threats. The story concludes with Miss Chandler's confession, the village healing through a memorial, and Clara Mrs. Lestrange starting anew. Miss Marple's quiet wisdom restores peace, leaving listeners with a satisfying resolution to a tale of betrayal, redemption, and the enduring power of truth. Chapter 1. The Vicarage Intruder. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a deceptive calm. Roses bloomed in neat cottage gardens, and the distant chime of the church bell signalled the approach of evening. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her hands, sat in the vicarage drawing-room, her sharp eyes darting between the delicate lace pattern and her hostess, Griselda Clement, the vicar's young wife. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and freshly baked scones, a tray of which sat untouched on the table between them. Griselda, with her usual vivacity, was recounting a humorous tale about the butcher's dog stealing a string of sausages, her laughter filling the air. "Oh, Jane, you should have seen Mr. Piggott's face red as a beetroot, chasing that mongrel." Down the lane, Griselda's eyes sparkled, her auburn curls bouncing as she leaned forward. "I swear, the village has more drama than a London stage." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Villagers, my dear, are never as quiet as they seem. There's always a story beneath the surface, waiting to be unravelled." Her voice was gentle, but there was a weight to her words, a hint of the wisdom that had made her a quiet legend in St. Mary Mead. Griselda waved a dismissive hand, reaching for a scone. "You and your mysteries, Jane. You'd find intrigue in a vicarage tea party." She paused, her hand hovering over the plate. "Though, I must say, that new man, Mr. Thorne, gives me the shivers. Always skulking about, never says a word. Leonard says he's harmless, but I don't know." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second, her interest piqued. "Reginald Thorne, you mean, the gentleman who took Rose Cottage last month?" She kept her tone light, but her memory was already sifting through details. A tall, gaunt man with a guarded expression, seen occasionally at the post office or slipping into the churchyard at dusk. "That's the one," Griselda said, spreading clotted cream on her scone. "He's like a ghost, isn't he? Never joins the village events, never speaks unless spoken to. I heard he's from London, some sort of retired businessman. But why come here, of all places?" Before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp scream pierced the air, cutting through the cosy atmosphere like a shard of glass. Griselda's scone fell to the floor, and Miss Marple's knitting slid onto her lap. The sound came from the direction of the vicarage study, where Leonard Clement, the vicar, often worked on his sermons. Griselda gasped, leaping to her feet. Miss Marple, with surprising agility for a woman of her years, followed. Her heart steady, but her senses sharpened. They hurried down the narrow hallway, the polished floorboards creaking underfoot. The study door was ajar, and as Griselda pushed it open, she froze, her hand flying to her mouth. Miss Marple stepped beside her, her gaze sweeping the scene with the precision of a hawk. Leonard Clement stood by his desk, his face ashen, his clerical collar slightly askew. Before him, sprawled across the Persian rug, lay Reginald Thorne, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. A dagger, its handle ornate and glinting in the fading sunlight, protruded from his chest. Blood had seeped into the rug, forming a dark halo around the body. The window behind the desk was open, its curtains fluttering in the breeze, and a single muddy footprint marked the sill. "Good heavens," Griselda whispered, clutching Miss Marple's arm. He's dead." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was racing. She stepped forward, careful not to disturb the scene, her eyes cataloguing every detail: the overturned inkpot on the desk, the untouched bookshelves, the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air. "Leonard," she said softly, "what happened?" The vicar shook his head, his hands trembling. I was in the garden, pruning the roses. I heard a noise, a sort of thud, and came in to find this." His voice cracked, and he gestured helplessly at the body. "I didn't touch anything, Jane. I swear it." Griselda, recovering slightly, rushed to her husband's side. "We must call Dr. Haydock and the police." "Oh, Leonard, how could this happen here?" Miss Marple's attention lingered on the footprint. It was large, uneven, with a distinctive tread pattern that suggested a heavy boot. "Curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "The mud is fresh, yet it hasn't rained in days." She glanced at the garden beyond the window, where the soil was dry and packed. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Haydock, a stout man with a brisk manner, arrived first, confirming what was already clear. Reginald Thorne was dead, likely killed instantly by the dagger's thrust. Constable Hurst followed, his notebook in hand, his young face flushed with the gravity of the situation. Villagers began to gather outside the vicarage, their whispers carrying on the evening breeze. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the study door, observed their faces' curiosity, fear, and something else she couldn't quite place. "Looks like a burglary gone wrong," Hurst declared, scratching his head. Thorne must have surprised the intruder, and they panicked. That open window's the entry point, no doubt. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Perhaps," she said, her tone neutral. "Though it's odd, don't you think that nothing appears to have been taken? The silver candlesticks are still on the desk, and that watch on Mr. Thorne's wrist is quite valuable." Hurst blinked, caught off guard. "Well, maybe they didn't have time to grab anything. Or perhaps," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but deliberate, "the intruder wasn't here to steal at all." She stepped closer to the window, examining the footprint again. This mud, it's not from the vicarage garden. It's too red, too clay-like. The soil here is loamy. Griselda, hovering nearby, looked at Miss Marple with a mix of awe and confusion. Jane, you don't think this was planned, do you? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned to Leonard, who was still pale, his hands clasped tightly together. Leonard, did Mr. Thorne ever visit the vicarage before today? The vicar hesitated, his eyes flickering to the floor. Once or twice, he said slowly. He came to discuss parish matters. Nothing significant. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind noted the pause, the slight tightening of his jaw. And did you see anyone near the vicarage this afternoon? Anyone unusual? Leonard shook his head. No one. Just the usual villagers passing by. I was in the garden most of the time. Dr. Haydock, packing his medical bag, interjected. I'll need to inform the coroner. This is a nasty business, Miss Marple. Not the sort of thing we expect in St. Mary Mead. No, Miss Marple agreed, her tone thoughtful. But human nature is the same everywhere, Doctor. And human nature has a way of surprising us. As the police began cordoning off the study, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, her eyes scanning the ground. The roses Leonard had been pruning were neatly trimmed, their petals scattered like confetti, but near the garden gate, partially hidden by a lavender bush, she spotted a faint smudge of red clay identical to the footprint on the sill. She crouched, her fingers brushing the earth. Interesting, she murmured. The clay matched the soil found near the old mill, a good mile from the vicarage. Whoever left that footprint had come from there, or deliberately brought the mud with them. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Griselda pouring tea with shaking hands. Jane, how do you stay so calm? I feel like my heart's going to burst. Miss Marple took the offered cup, her smile reassuring. One learns, my dear, that panic clouds the mind, and a clear mind is what we need now. She sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to Reginald Thorne. A recluse, a newcomer, yet someone had known him well enough to kill him in this intimate, calculated way. The dagger, she noted, was no ordinary weapon. Its handle was carved with an intricate design, almost ceremonial, not the sort of thing one carried casually. Griselda, she said, setting down her cup. Tell me more about Mr. Thorne. Did he ever mention family, friends, or enemies? Griselda frowned, thinking. Not really. He kept to himself. But Mrs. Price at the post office said he got letters every week, always in the same handwriting. She thought it was a woman's hand, but she couldn't be sure. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Letters, you say? That's worth knowing. She made a mental note to visit Mrs. Price. The postmistress had a knack for noticing details, even if she didn't always understand their significance. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, the vicarage buzzed with quiet activity. Constable Hurst questioned the gardener, who swore he'd seen no one near the study. Dr. Haydock left for the coroner's office, and Leonard retreated to his room, claiming a headache. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the drawing room, her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. The footprint, the dagger, the vicar's hesitation, they were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to weave. Griselda, sitting opposite, broke the silence. Jane, do you really think this wasn't a burglary? I mean, who would want to kill Mr. Thorne? He was nobody. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. Nobody is ever nobody, Griselda. Mr. Thorne had a past, and someone in St. Mary Mead knew it well enough to end his life. She paused, her eyes meeting Griselda's. The footprint tells me our killer is no stranger to this village. They walked through that window with purpose, and they knew exactly where to find Mr. Thorn. Griselda shivered. You make it sound so personal. It is, Miss Marple said softly. Murder always is. As the church bell tolled 7, Miss Marple rose, folding her knitting into her bag. I'll take a walk to the post office tomorrow, she said. Mrs. Price might have more to share about those letters. She smiled, her expression as gentle as ever, but her mind was already tracing the invisible lines connecting Thorn, the vicarage, and the muddy footprint. The chapter closed with Miss Marple stepping into the cool evening air. The vicarage behind her, now a house of secrets. The village lay quiet, but she knew better than to trust its tranquility. Somewhere, perhaps in a cottage down the lane or a shadowed corner of the old mill, the truth waited, and Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was determined to find it. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parish. The morning after the murder at the vicarage. St. Mary Mead buzzed with a nervous energy that belied its sleepy charm. The cobblestone lanes, usually alive with the cheerful clatter of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers, carried hushed voices and furtive glances. News of Reginald Thorn's death had spread like wildfire, fanned by the villagers' insatiable curiosity. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the morning sun, walked briskly toward the post office, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, but her mind was far from the soft wool within. The muddy footprint, the ornate dagger, and Leonard Clement's hesitant answers lingered in her thoughts, each a puzzle piece waiting to be placed. The post office, a squat building with ivy clinging to its walls, was already crowded when Miss Marple arrived. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, stood behind the counter, her spectacles perched on her nose as she sorted letters with practiced efficiency. A gaggle of villagers, Mrs. Weatherby from the bakery, old Mr. Finch with his walking stick, and the perpetually flustered Miss Hartnell hovered near the counter, their voices overlapping in a symphony of speculation. I heard it was a robbery, Mrs. Weatherby said, her flour-dusted apron flapping as she gestured. They say the vicarage is full of silver, and that Thorn fellow got in the way. Nonsense, Miss Hartnell snapped, her thin lips pursed. Thorn was trouble from the moment he arrived, skulking about like a fox in a henhouse. I wouldn't be surprised if he brought this on himself. Miss Marple slipped into the shop, her presence barely noticed amid the clamour. She lingered by a display of postcards, her ears attuned to the conversation. Mrs. Price, catching her eye, gave a small nod before turning to the others. Now, let's not jump to conclusions, she said, her voice sharp but kind. Poor Mr. Thorn's barely cold, and here you are, spinning tales. Mr. Finch leaned on his stick, his rheumy eyes narrowing. He wasn't one of us, that's for sure. Never came to church, never joined the whist club. What was he hiding, eh? Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, drawing their attention. Good morning, Mrs. Price, she said, her tone as mild as a summer breeze. I wonder if I might have a word about Mr. Thorn's post. Griselda mentioned he received regular letters. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Mrs. Price adjusted her spectacles, a spark of interest in her gaze. Well, Miss Marple, you're not one for idle gossip, so I'll tell you what I know. Mr. Thorn got letters every Tuesday, like clockwork, always in a cream envelope, sealed with wax, and addressed in a fine, looping hand. I'd say a lady's writing, but I couldn't swear to it. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Every Tuesday, you say, and did he ever send replies? Not that I saw, Mrs. Price replied, stacking a pile of envelopes. He'd collect his post, give a curt nod, and be off. Never lingered, never chatted, not like most folk round here. Miss Hartnell snorted. Secretive, that's what. He was, probably mixed up in something unsavoury. Mark my words, this is no simple burglary. Mrs. Weatherby nodded vigorously. I heard Constable Hurst found a footprint by the window. Some tramp from the mill, maybe. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind noted the mention of the millet's red clay soil matched the footprint she'd seen. Perhaps, she said, her voice thoughtful, though tramps rarely carry daggers with carved handles, don't you think? The villagers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Mrs. Price leaned forward, lowering her voice. Miss Marple, you've got that look in your eye. You think there's more to this, don't you? I think, Miss Marple said, choosing her words carefully, that Mr. Thorne's death was no accident. Someone wanted him gone, and they took great pains to make it happen. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Mrs. Price, did you ever notice anyone watching Mr. Thorne when he collected his post? The postmistress frowned. Thinking now that you mention it, there was a fellow last week. Tall, wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low. Stood across the street, just watching. I thought he was waiting for someone, but he left as soon as Thorne did. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. And did you recognize him? Mrs. Price shook her head. Not one of our locals, I'd wager. Too purposeful, if you know what I mean. The bell above the door jingled, signalling the arrival of another customer. Miss Marple stepped aside, her mind already turning over this new piece of information. A stranger watching Thorne suggested a connection beyond the village, but the footprint tied the crime to St. Mary Mead. The contradiction intrigued her as she left the post office. Miss Marple decided to detour to the church, where the weekly parish meeting was about to begin. The stone path wound through the churchyard, where ancient youths cast long shadows over weathered gravestones. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint tints of wax from the church's open door. Inside, the pews were filling, with villagers, their murmurs a low hum beneath the vaulted ceiling. Leonard Clement stood at the pulpit, his face drawn but composed as he welcomed the group. Griselda sat in the front row, her usual brightness dimmed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd. There was Dr. Haydock, his medical bag at his feet. Miss Chandler, quiet friend who kept her eyes downcast, and Mrs. Lestrange, the elegant newcomer, whose silk scarf seemed out of place among the villagers' modest attire. Miss Marple noted the tension in Leonard's posture as he spoke about upcoming church events. His voice clipped, his gaze darting to the door. Poor Leonard, whispered Mrs. Weatherby, who had slid into the pew beside Miss Marple. This business with Thorne must be weighing on him. A murder in his own study. Miss Marple nodded, her attention fixed on the vicar. It's a heavy burden, she murmured, especially when the circumstances are so unclear. The meeting dragged on with discussions about the flower rota and the choir schedule, but Miss Marple's focus remained on Leonard. His hands gripped the pulpit tightly, and when a parishioner asked about the vicarage's safety, he snapped, "It's being handled, Mrs. Finch. Let's move on." The sharpness in his tone drew gasps, and Griselda's head whipped around. Her eyes wide as the meeting ended, Miss Marple lingered, watching as Leonard hurried out. Brushing past Dr. Haydock's outstretched hand, Griselda followed, her face pale. Miss Marple rose, her steps slow but deliberate, and made her way to the churchyard, where she spotted a small, overlooked detail, a scrap of cream-coloured paper caught in the brambles near the vicarage gate. She retrieved it carefully, her gloved fingers unfolding it to reveal a fragment of a letter written in a looping hand. The words were faint but legible. "Meet me at dusk, or the truth will come out." Her heart quickened. The handwriting matched Mrs. Price's description of Thorn's letters. Tucking the fragment into her bag, she glanced toward the vicarage, where Leonard stood in the garden, staring at the roses as if they held answers. The letter suggested a rendezvous, perhaps one that had taken place in the study. But why there? And why had it ended in murder? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Miss Chandler, who approached, her face drawn. "Miss Marple, is it true what they're saying? That Mr. Thorn was stabbed in the vicarage?" "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple replied gently. "A terrible shock for us all." Miss Chandler's eyes filled with tears. Griselda's beside herself. "She thinks Leonard's hiding something. He's been so strange lately, locking himself in his study at all hours." Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her mind was racing. "Grief affects us all differently, my dear. Perhaps Leonard is simply overwhelmed." She patted Miss Chandler's hand, but her thoughts lingered on the vicar's behaviour. His curtness, his evasiveness, could he know more about Thorn's death than he was letting on? As Miss Chandler walked away, Miss Marple stood alone in the churchyard, the letter fragment heavy in her bag. The parish meeting had revealed tensions, and the letter hinted at a secret meeting gone horribly wrong. Thorn's killer was no outsider, she was certain. The muddy footprint, the dagger, the letter, they all pointed to someone who knew the vicarage's layout, someone who moved with purpose, and Leonard's unease suggested he might hold a key to the mystery, whether he realized it or not. The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking slowly back toward her cottage, the village bathed in the soft light of late morning. The whispers of St. Mary Mead were growing louder, and she knew they would lead her closer to the truth. Tomorrow she would visit the old mill, where the red clay might offer more clues. For now she clutched her bag, the letter fragment a silent promise that the killer's secrets would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 3. The Hidden Correspondence. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the old mill. Her straw hat was tilted against the damp air, and her knitting bag, ever present, bumped gently against her hip. The letter fragment from the churchyard weighed heavily in her thoughts. Its cryptic words, "Meet me at dusk, or the truth will come out," echoing like a whispered challenge. The red clay footprint, the ornate dagger, Leonard's unease. And now this mysterious note formed a delicate web, and Miss Marple was determined to trace its threads. The old mill, a crumbling relic at the edge of the village, stood silent by the sluggish stream. Its weathered stones were streaked with moss, and the air carried the earthy scent of damp clay. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. There, in a patch of soft earth near the mill's entrance, she spotted it, a faint impression of a boot, its tread matching the one on the vicarage windowsill. The red clay was unmistakable, its ruddy hue distinct from the village's loamy soil. She crouched, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the print. "Someone came this way," she murmured, "and not long before the murder." Rising, she glanced toward the mill's broken windows, half expecting to see a face peering back. The place was deserted, but its stillness felt watchful, as if it held secrets of its own. She made a mental note to ask Mrs. Price if Thorn had ever been seen near the mill. For now, the footprint confirmed her suspicion. The killer was no stranger passing through St. Mary Mead. Returning to the village, Miss Marple headed for the post office, where the letter fragment might find its match. The bell jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Price looked up from her counter, her spectacles glinting. "Back so soon, Miss Marple," she said, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I reckon you're after more than stamps today." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You know me too well, Mrs. Price. I'd like to see one of Mr. Thorne's letters, if you still have any. The handwriting may be important." Mrs. Price hesitated, her fingers tapping the counter. "Well, it's not strictly proper, but seeing as it's you..." She rummaged beneath the counter and produced a cream envelope, its wax seal broken but the looping script clear. This came for him 2 days ago. He hadn't collected it yet. Miss Marple took the envelope, her heart quickening as she compared it to the fragment in her bag. The handwriting was identical, each curve and flourish a perfect match. The letter inside was brief, written in the same elegant hand. "Reginald, time is running out. Meet me as agreed, or I'll tell them everything. You know where." No signature, no address, but the threat was unmistakable. "This is most helpful," Miss Marple said, handing the envelope back. "Did Mr. Thorne ever mention who sent these?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "Not a word, but I'll tell you something odd. Last week, when he came for his post, he looked rattled, kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected someone to jump out." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. "And the man you saw watching him, did he appear again?" "Not that I noticed," Mrs. Price said, frowning. "But I've been busy with the post. Could have missed him." Thanking her, Miss Marple stepped outside, her mind buzzing. The letter's threat suggested blackmail, and Thorne's nervousness hinted at a man under pressure. But who in St. Mary Mead would have such leverage over a recluse? And why meet at the Vicarage, of all places? Her next stop was the village library, a modest building tucked behind the church. Miss Tuttle, the librarian, was a quiet woman with a memory for details rivaling Miss Marple's own. If anyone had records of Thorne's past, it would be her. The library smelled of old paper and wax polish, its shelves lined with books and stacks of yellowing newspapers. Miss Tuttle looked up from her desk, her grey bun as neat as ever. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice hushed. "Heard about the trouble at the Vicarage. Dreadful business." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, setting her bag down. "I was wondering if you might have any old newspapers from London, say 5 or 10 years back. I'm curious about Mr. Thorne's history." Miss Tuttle's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "I'll see what I can find. We keep the Times and the Daily Mail in the archives." She disappeared into the back room, returning with a stack of brittle papers. "These go back to 1915. Any particular year?" "Let's start with 1918, Miss Marple said, recalling a hunch about Thorne's guarded demeanour. As Miss Tuttle spread the papers on a table, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the headlines, her fingers flipping pages with care. Half an hour later, she found it, a small article buried in the financial section of the Times. Dated June 1918, "Financier disappears amid fraud allegations." The headline read. The article described one Reginald Harcourt, a London businessman, accused of embezzling funds from a charitable trust. Harcourt had vanished before charges could be filed, leaving investors, many from rural parishes. A grainy photograph showed a younger Thorne, his gaunt features unmistakable despite a different name. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Reginald Harcourt," she murmured. "So that's who you were." The article mentioned a partner, a woman, named Eliza Warren, who had also disappeared. Could she be the author of the letters? Or was she here, in St. Mary Mead, under a new name? Thanking Miss Tuttle, Miss Marple left the library, her mind racing. Thorne's past as a disgraced financier explained his reclusiveness, but it also raised questions. Had someone from his old life tracked him down? The letter's threat suggested a personal vendetta, and the Vicarage's study was an oddly specific place for a confrontation as she walked home. Miss Marple passed the Blue Boar, the village's only on impulse. She stepped inside, the smoky warmth of the tap room, a contrast to the crisp air outside. The barmaid, Polly, a cheerful girl with freckles, was polishing glasses behind the counter. "Morning, Miss Marple," she called. "Fancy a cuppa? Or are you here about poor Mr. Thorne?" "A cup of tea would be lovely," Miss Marple said, settling at a corner table. "And perhaps a word about Mr. Thorne. Did he ever come here?" Polly poured the tea, her expression thoughtful. "Once or twice, kept to himself, mostly. But 3 nights ago, I saw him arguing outside with a man. Couldn't hear much, but Thorne looked angry, jabbing his finger like he meant business." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. What did the man look like? "Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low," Polly said, echoing Mrs. Price's description. "Didn't see his face clear, but he had a funny way of standing, like he was trying not to be noticed." They were by the alley near the bins. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the coincidence. The same man watching Thorne at the post office and now arguing with him. It was no coincidence at all. "Did you hear anything they said, Polly?" Polly leaned closer, her voice low. "Just a bit. Something about paying what's owed and no more chances." Then Thorne stormed off, and the other man vanished into the dark. Thanking Polly, Miss Marple finished her tea and stepped back into the street. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. The letter, the footprint, the argument, they all pointed to a calculated act, not a random crime. Thorne's past had caught up with him, and someone in St. Mary Mead had known exactly how to strike as she reached her cottage. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes lingering on the village green. The parish meeting last night had shown cracks in the community's Comlinard's sharpness, Griselda's anxiety, and the curious presence of Mrs. Lestrange, whose silk scarf and guarded demeanour stood out. Could she be Eliza Warren, Thorne's old partner? Or was the killer someone closer, someone who knew the Vicarage's layout intimately? The chapter closed with Miss Marple sitting by her fire, the letter fragment on her lap. She unfolded it. Once more, studying the looping script. The threat was clear, but the writer's identity remained elusive. Tomorrow she would visit the Grimsbys, a family rumoured to have lost their savings in a financial scandal years ago. If Thorne was indeed Harcourt, their anger might hold a clue. For now, she set the fragment aside, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, each click a step closer to unraveling the truth. Chapter 4. Shadows of Scandal. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The letter fragment and the newspaper. Article about Reginald Harcourt, Talia's Thorn lay before her, their secrets whispering of a past that had reached into St. Mary Mead with deadly intent. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind weaving a tapestry of clues, the red clay footprint, the looping handwriting, the argument at the Blue Boar, and now Thorn's history as a disgraced financier. Today she would visit the Grimsbys, whose financial ruin might connect to Thorn's scandal, but first she needed to observe the village's pulse. St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation. The murder at the Vicarage fueling conversations in every shop and garden. Miss Marple, her straw hat firmly in place, walked toward the Grimsbys' modest cottage on the village's edge. The air was crisp, scented with honeysuckle and the faint tang of woods. As she passed the church, she noticed Griselda Clement hurrying across the green, her face pale, a basket of flowers swinging from her arm. Miss Marple raised a hand in greeting, but Griselda's distracted nod suggested a woman preoccupied. The Grimsby's cottage was a humble affair, its thatched roof sagging slightly, its garden overgrown with nettles. Mrs. Grimsby, a wiry woman with greying hair pulled into a severe bun, opened the door, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Miss Marple. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, her tone guarded. "What brings you here?" "I thought you might like some company," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, "and perhaps a word about poor Mr. Thorn. It's shaken us all, hasn't it?" Mrs. Grimsby hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, then. Mind the step." The parlour was sparsely furnished, the air heavy with the smell of damp wool and boiled cabbage. Mr. Grimsby, a stooped man with weathered hands, sat by the fire, his pipe unlit. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple settled into a worn chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Such a tragedy at the vicarage," she began, her eyes soft but watchful. "Did you know Mr. Thorn well?" "Not at all," Mrs. Grimsby said sharply, folding her arms. "Kept to himself, didn't he? Never had time for the likes of us." Double quotes. Mr. Grimsby coughed, his voice low. "Saw him once or twice at the market. Always in a hurry, looking over his shoulder like he owed someone money." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Curious, isn't it? A man so private, yet someone knew him well enough to end things so violently." She paused, noting Mrs. Grimsby's sudden stillness. "I heard tell of a financial scandal some years back, one that hurt many families. Were you ever caught up in such a thing?" The room grew tense, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Mrs. Grimsby's eyes darted to her husband, who shifted uncomfortably. "We lost our savings in 18, she said at last, her voice tight. "A London man, Harcourt, took everything, promised us riches, then vanished, left us with nothing but debts." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "How dreadful. And Mr. Thorn, did he ever remind you of anyone from that time?" Mr. Grimsby's pipe fell to the floor with a clatter. He bent to retrieve it, his hands shaking. "Never met Harcourt in person," he muttered. "Just sent money through the post. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely a thought," Miss Marple said airily, but her mind was racing. The Grimsby's loss tied directly to Thorn's past, and their guarded demeanour suggested more than grief. Could their anger have turned to vengeance? She changed tack, keeping her tone light. "I found a curious item near the vicarage, a handkerchief, monogrammed with an E. Have you seen such a thing?" Mrs. Grimsby's face tightened. "Plenty of folk have handkerchiefs. Could be anyone's." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, rising. "Well, I shan't keep you. Thank you for the chat." As she stepped outside, she glanced back, catching Mrs. Grimsby's whispered exchange with her husband, their voices too low to hear. The handkerchief, she suspected, was no random find. Its fine linen and delicate embroidery pointed to someone of means, someone like Mrs. Lestrange, whose silk scarf had caught her eye at the parish meeting. Determined to follow this lead, Miss Marple headed toward the village green, where the weekly market was in full swing. Stalls lined the square, offering everything from fresh apples to homemade jams. The air hummed with voices, but the undercurrent of gossip was unmistakable. Miss Marple paused by a stall selling ribbons, her ears catching snippets of conversation. "Thorn was no good," muttered a farmer, hefting a sack of potatoes. "Heard he crossed the wrong people in London." "Rubbish," said the stallholder, a plump woman with a sharp tongue. "It's one of us, mark my words. That dagger wasn't some tramp's blade." Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of the dagger. Its ornate handle had puzzled her from the start, too distinctive for a common thief. She approached the stall, her smile disarming. "Good morning, Mrs. Baker. I couldn't help overhearing. Have you heard any talk about where such a dagger might come from?" Mrs. Baker leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. "Not a whisper, Miss Marple, but I'll tell you it's no ordinary knife. My cousin in London says collectors pay a fortune for such things. Maybe Thorn was mixed up with some fancy folk." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. A collector's dagger suggested a killer with access to rare items, narrowing the field. As she moved through the market, she spotted Mrs. Lestrange browsing a stall of second-hand books, her gloved hands turning pages with care. The monogrammed handkerchief flashed in Miss Marple's mind. Could the E stand for Eliza, Thorn's old partner from the scandal? Approaching, Miss Marple adopted her most genial tone. "Mrs. Lestrange, how lovely to see you. Are you settling into St. Mary Mead?" Mrs. Lestrange started, her dark eyes flickering with unease. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, quite well, thank you." Her voice was smooth, but her fingers tightened on the book she held. "Dreadful news about Mr. Thorn, isn't it?" "Terrible," Miss Marple agreed, her gaze lingering on the woman's gloves. "I found a handkerchief near the vicarage, monogrammed with an E. I don't suppose it's yours." Mrs. Lestrange's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "No, not mine. I prefer silk, you see." She gestured to her scarf, its emerald sheen catching the light. "Perhaps it belongs to someone else." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. She thanked Mrs. Lestrange and moved on, but the woman's unease lingered in her mind. The handkerchief was a clue, and Mrs. Lestrange's reaction suggested she knew more than she let on. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage to check on Griselda, who was arranging flowers in the hall. The young woman's hands trembled as she clipped a rose stem. "Jane, I can't stop thinking about it," she said, her voice low. "Leonard's been so distant since it happened. He won't talk about it, not even to me." Miss Marple patted her arm. "He's had a shock, my dear. Give him time." But her eyes strayed to the study door, now locked, and she wondered what Leonard might be hiding. The handkerchief, the Grimsby's anger, Mrs. Lestrange's unease, they were all threads. But the pattern was still unclear. The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking home under a sky streaked with crimson. She paused by the vicarage gate, her eyes falling on the spot where she'd found the letter fragment. The handkerchief, she decided, was the next key. Its owner was tied to Thorn's death, and she suspected it was no coincidence that it appeared near the scene. Tomorrow, she would press Leonard about his meetings with Thorn, and perhaps visit Mrs. Lestrange's cottage. For now, she tightened her shawl against the evening chill, her mind alight with the certainty that the killer's identity was closer than anyone realized. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Secret. The dawn light crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the rooftops with a soft pink glow. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea steaming gently as she studied the monogrammed handkerchief she'd found near the vicarage gate. Its fine linen and elegant embroidery spoke of refinement, yet its presence at the crime scene suggested a careless mistake or a deliberate plant. The letter fragment, the red clay footprint, Thorn's scandalous past as Reginald Harcourt, and the Grimsby's guarded anger swirled in her mind. Today she would confront Leonard Clement, whose evasiveness at the parish meeting and Griselda's worried whispers hinted at a secret he was reluctant to share. Miss Marple tucked the handkerchief into her knitting bag and set out for the vicarage, her steps brisk despite the early hour. The village was stirring, with milk bottles clinking on doorsteps and the scent of fresh bread wafting from Mrs. Weatherby's bakery. As she approached the vicarage, she noticed the curtains drawn tight, an unusual sight for a house that typically welcomed the morning sun. Griselda answered her knock, her auburn curls dishevelled, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Jane, thank goodness," Griselda said, ushering her inside. "I haven't slept a wink. Leonard's been pacing all night, muttering about the parish accounts. He won't tell me what's wrong." Miss Marple's expression was sympathetic, but her mind sharpened. "Let's have a cup of tea, my dear, and see if we can't ease his burden." She followed Griselda to the drawing room, where the air was heavy with the scent of wilted flowers from yesterday's arrangement. Leonard stood by the fireplace, his clerical collar askew, his hands clasped behind his back. He started at their entrance, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained, "I wasn't expecting you so early. I thought a visit might help," she replied, settling into a chair. "This dreadful business with Mr. Thorn has upset us all. I wondered if you might share more about his visits here. You mentioned he came to discuss parish matters." Leonard's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Griselda, who hovered anxiously by the tea tray. "It was nothing out of the ordinary," he said, his tone clipped. "He asked about contributing to the church restoration fund. I told him we'd welcome any donation." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was steady. "And did he seem troubled during these talks? Perhaps about his past?" Leonard hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. He was reserved, as always, kept his business to himself. He paused, then added, almost too quickly, "I had no reason to think he was in danger." Griselda set down a teacup with a clatter. "Leonard, you're not telling her everything. You were in the study with him that morning, before it happened. I heard you arguing." The room fell silent, the ticking of the mantel clock loud in the stillness. Leonard's face flushed, and he turned to the window, his back rigid. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Leonard, if you know something, it's best to share it now. Secrets have a way of festering, especially in a village like ours." He turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of fear. "Very well," he said at last, his voice low. "Thorn came to me that morning, yes. He wanted to make a substantial donation, but he asked me to keep it anonymous. Said it was for charitable matters he didn't wish to discuss. I pressed him, and he grew agitated, said it was to make amends for past mistakes." Miss Marple's mind raced. Amends for past mistakes, Thorns. Fraught as Harcourt, perhaps. And did you agree to his terms? She asked. I did, Leonard admitted, his shoulders sagging. But I told him the parish accounts are public, and anonymity might be difficult. He left in a huff, and that was the last I saw of him, alive. Griselda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Why didn't you tell me, Leonard? You've been carrying this alone. I didn't want to worry you, he said, his voice breaking, and with the police poking about, I thought it best to stay quiet. Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Leonard's story rang true, yet his hesitation suggested he was holding back. Had Thorne's donation been a bribe, a way to buy silence? And why meet in the study, where the dagger awaited? She decided to test another thread. Leonard, have you ever seen a handkerchief with an E monogram? I found one near the gate, and it seems out of place. Leonard frowned, shaking. His head, no, nothing like that. Perhaps one of Griselda's friends dropped it. Griselda shook her head. None of my friends use monogrammed handkerchiefs, Jane. It's too fancy for St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. The handkerchief pointed to someone with refined tastes, and Mrs. Lestrange's silk scarf flashed in her memory. But another clue beckoned. Leonard, might I see your study? I know the police have been through, but a fresh eye can't hurt. Leonard hesitated, then nodded. If you must, but it's a mess, I'm afraid. He led her down the hall, unlocking the study door with a key he pulled from his pocket. The room was as she remembered, the desk cluttered with papers, the Persian rug stained with Thorne's blood, the window now closed, but the muddy footprint still visible on the sill. Miss Marple's eyes swept the space, landing on a small, locked drawer in the desk. Leonard, she said, her tone casual, what do you keep in there? He stiffened. Just personal papers, sermons, letters, that sort of thing. May I see? She asked, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. Leonard's hands trembled as he unlocked the drawer, revealing a stack of envelopes and a small photograph. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she recognized Thorne's gaunt face in the image. Standing beside a woman with dark hair and a guarded smile, the photograph was old, its edges worn, but the woman's elegance was striking. Who is she? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected the answer. I don't know, Leonard said, too quickly. Thorne left it here after one of our meetings, said it was a keepsake. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was racing. The woman could be Eliza Warren, Dawn's partner in the fraud, or someone closer to home, the locked drawer suggested. Leonard valued the photograph for feared its discovery. She thanked him and returned to the drawing room, where Griselda was pouring more tea, her hands steadier now. Jane, do you think Leonard's in trouble? Griselda whispered, glancing toward the hall. Not necessarily, Miss Marple said, patting her hand. But he's carrying a burden, and I mean to find out what it is. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and stepped into the garden, where the roses still bore the marks of Leonard's pruning. As she walked toward the gate, she noticed a faint glint in the grass, a tiny pearl button, half buried in the soil. She picked it up, noting its delicate design, too fine for a villager's everyday wear. Another clue, perhaps linked to the handkerchief. The chapter closed with Miss Marple standing at her cottage gate, the button and photograph in her mind's eye. Leonard's secret meeting with Thorne, the locked drawer, the mysterious woman, each piece deepened the mystery. Tomorrow she would visit Mrs. Lestrange, whose elegance and unease made her a likely candidate for the handkerchief's owner. For now, she gazed at the quiet village, its peaceful facade hiding a killer's intent. With a soft sigh, she turned toward her cottage, her knitting needles waiting, each click a step closer to the truth. Chapter 6. A lady's discretion. The midday sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, its rays piercing the thin clouds and warming the cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shielding her eyes, walked purposefully toward Mrs. Lestrange's cottage at the edge of the village. The pearl button and the photograph from Leonard's study weighed on her mind. Alongside the monogrammed handkerchief, the threatening letter fragment, and Thorne's murky past as Reginald Harcourt. Leonard's guarded admission about Thorne's charitable matters hinted at a deeper connection, and Mrs. Lestrange's elegance and unease made her a focal point in the unfolding mystery. Today, Miss Marple intended to test her suspicions. Mrs. Lestrange's cottage, a charming stone building with climbing roses, stood apart from the village's huddled homes. Its windows gleamed, and the garden was meticulously tended, a contrast to the Grimsby's neglected plot. Miss Marple knocked, her knitting bag at her side, and waited. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Lestrange, her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, her silk blouse shimmering faintly. Her smile was polite but strained, her eyes flickering with caution. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as polished. "Glass, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in." The parlour was tastefully furnished, with a velvet settee and a vase of fresh lilies perfuming the air. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her gaze sweeping the room. A small writing desk caught her eye, its surface adorned with cream-coloured stationery and a wax seal stamp. The resemblance to Thorne's letters was striking, but she kept her expression serene. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Lestrange," Miss Marple began, her tone warm. "I've been helping Griselda through this dreadful business with Mr. Thorne. It's left the village quite shaken." Mrs. Lestrange nodded, her fingers smoothing her skirt. "A terrible tragedy. I barely knew the man, but to think such a thing could happen here." She trailed off, her eyes darting to the window. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You're new to St. Mary Mead, aren't you? It must be difficult, settling in amid such turmoil. Did you ever speak with Mr. Thorne?" "Only in passing," Mrs. Lestrange said quickly. "He was at the church once or twice. Not much for conversation." Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, betraying her calm facade. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I found a handkerchief near the vicarage, monogrammed with an E. I thought it might be yours, given your taste for fine things." She gestured to the silk scarf draped over a chair. Mrs. Lestrange's smile stiffened. "I'm afraid not. I use silk, as you see. Linen is not my preference." Her voice was steady, but her fingers twitched, brushing against a small locket at her throat. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind flashing to the photograph in Leonard's drawer. The woman in it had worn a similar locket, its shape distinctive. "Of course," she said mildly, "and this button pearl, quite delicate. It was near the vicarage gate. Perhaps you've seen one like it." She produced the button, holding it in her gloved palm. Mrs. Lestrange's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she shook her head. "No, I haven't. It could belong to anyone." Miss Marple tucked the button away, her smile unchanged. "Quite right. Well, I shan't keep you. I'm sure you're busy." She rose, but as she reached the door, she paused. "One last thing. Did you ever notice Mr. Thorne receiving letters? Mrs. Price mentioned he got them regularly, in a fine hand." Mrs. Lestrange's face paled, but she recovered swiftly. "I wouldn't know. I keep to myself, Miss Marple." Her tone was polite but final. As Miss Marple stepped into the garden, she felt the weight of Mrs. Lestrange's gaze on her back. The stationery, the locket, the nervous twitch each, was a thread tying her to Thorn's past. Could she be Eliza Warren, the partner who vanished with him after the fraud? The locket suggested a personal connection, and the stationery was too close a match to ignore. The village fete was underway on the green. A cheerful affair with bunting strung between trees and tables laden with cakes and preserves. Miss Marple decided to attend, knowing the crowd would loosen tongues and reveal hidden tensions. The air was thick with the scent of sugar and grass, and children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the strum of a fiddler. She spotted Dr. Haydock near a lemonade stand, his medical bag at his feet. Deep in conversation with Mrs. Lestrange, Miss Marple approached, her presence unnoticed as she lingered by a table of knitted scarves. Dr. Haydock's voice was low. "Urgent. You must be careful, Clara. People are talking," and with the police sniffing around Mrs. Lestrange, Clara cut him off, her voice sharp. "I've done nothing wrong, James. Let them talk." She turned, her eyes catching Miss Marple's, and froze. A moment later, she dropped her locket, its chain snapping as it hit the ground. Dr. Haydock bent to retrieve it, but Miss Marple was faster, scooping it up with a deft hand. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Mrs. Lestrange said, her voice tight. "Thank you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple handed it back, her fingers brushing the locket's engraved surface. "A lovely piece," she said. "Is it a family heirloom?" Mrs. Lestrange's smile was brittle. "Something like that." She excused herself, hurrying toward the tea tent, while Dr. Haydock lingered, his expression uneasy. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, enjoying the fete. "Very much," she replied, her eyes keen. "You and Mrs. Lestrange seem close. Has she settled in well?" Dr. Haydock's jaw tightened. "She's a private woman, keeps her own counsel." He glanced at his watch. "I must check on a patient. Good day." Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Clara possibly Eliza Warren had a connection to Dr. Haydock, and their hushed exchange suggested shared secrets. The locket's engraving, glimpsed briefly, bore the initials E.W. It was no coincidence, she was certain, as the fete wound down. Miss Marple wandered to the edge of the green, where a group of children played near the churchyard. One of them, a boy with a mop of curls, held up a shiny object. "Look," Miss Marple found it in the grass. It was a wax seal stamp, its handle carved with a rose motif, identical to the one on Mrs. Lestrange's desk. "Well done, Tommy," she said, taking it carefully. "I'll see it gets back to its owner." The stamp was another link to the letters, and its presence near the churchyard suggested Mrs. Lestrange had been careless or desperate. The chapter closed with Miss Marple sitting on a bench, the wax stamp in her hand. The fate's music faded into the evening, but her thoughts were sharp. Mrs. Lestrange's false identity as Clara was all but confirmed, and her connection to Thorn perhaps, as Eliza Warren pointed to a motive rooted in their shared past. Dr. Haydock's familiarity with her hinted at his own involvement, though whether as ally or accomplice remained unclear. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would visit the doctor, probing his knowledge of Thorn's final days. For now, she tucked the stamp into her bag, the village's cheerful facade hiding a truth she was determined to uncover. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Dilemma. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the dew still clinging to the grass as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Dr. Haydock's surgery. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, but her thoughts were heavy with the clues she'd gathered: the wax seal stamp, the locket with EW, the photograph in Leonard's drawer, and Mrs. Lestrange's guarded demeanour at the fete. The doctor's urgent whisper to hurkling her Clara had deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. Could he know more about Thorn's death than he let on? Today she aimed to find out. The surgery, a tidy brick building beside the village hall, smelled of antiseptic and carbolic soap. Dr. Haydock was at his desk, scribbling notes, his medical bag open beside him. His broad face broke into a smile as Miss Marple entered, but his eyes held a flicker of wariness. Miss Marple, an unexpected visit. Not feeling under the weather, I hope. Not at all, doctor, she replied, settling into a chair. Her straw hat rested on her lap, her hands folded neatly. I've come about poor Mr. Thorn. You examined him at the vicarage, didn't you? Such a shocking affair, Dr. Haydock's smile faded. Shocking, yes. A clean wound, straight to the heart. Whoever wielded that dagger knew what they were doing. He leaned back, his fingers drumming on the desk. The police are still calling it a burglary, but I'm not so sure. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Nor am I, tell me. Did you know Mr. Thorn well? Perhaps as a patient. The doctor hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. He came to me once, about a month ago, complained of headaches, nerves. I prescribed a mild tonic, nothing serious. His voice was steady, but his fingers stilled, betraying tension. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle. Nerves, you say? Did he mention what troubled him? A man like Thorn, so private, must have had his reasons. Dr. Haydock shifted in his chair. He wasn't one for confidences. Said it was the quiet of the village too different from London. I didn't press him. He met her eyes, his expression guarded. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? You've got that look, like you're piecing something together. She smiled, undeterred, only trying to understand the man. I found a curious item at the fete yesterday, a wax seal stamp, quite like the one used on Thorn's letters. And then there's this. She produced the pearl button, holding it up. Found near the vicarage. It's fine work, not common. Here, Dr. Haydock's face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened. Plenty of folk pass through the churchyard. Could be anyone's. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, tucking the button away. But I couldn't help noticing your conversation with Mrs. Lestrange at the fete. You seemed concerned for her. The doctor's eyes narrowed. Clara's a friend, that's all. She's new here, and this murder's got everyone on edge. I was just checking on her. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Of course, it's kind of you to look out for her. Did she ever mention knowing Thorn? They're both from London, after all. Dr. Haydock stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. No, she didn't, and I've patience to see, Miss Marple. If you'll excuse me, before he could usher her out. Miss Marple rose, her voice soft but deliberate. One last thing, Doctor. Did you ever treat Thorn for anything unusual? A condition, perhaps, that might explain his nervousness. The question hung in the air. Dr. Haydock's hand paused on the door handle, and for a moment his guard slipped. As a matter of fact, he said slowly, he came to me a week before he died, complaining of nausea and tremors. I suspected poisoning, something slow-acting, like belladonna. I gave him an antidote and told him to avoid whatever. He'd ingested. He wouldn't say where it came from, but he was shaken. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Poison a failed attempt before the dagger. And did you report this to the police? She asked. Not yet. Dr. Haydock admitted, his voice low. I wasn't sure it was relevant, and with the stabbing, well, it seemed secondary. Miss Marple's lips pursed, but she nodded. Thank you, Doctor. You've been most helpful. She stepped outside, the surgery door clicking shut behind her. Poison suggested a killer with patience, someone who had tried once and, failing, resorted to a more direct method. The vicarage's intimacy as the crime scene pointed to someone with access, someone trusted. Her next stop was the vicarage garden, where she hoped to find another clue tying the poison to the scene. The roses were still in bloom, their petals scattered across the path. As she approached the greenhouse, a small structure tucked behind the vicarage, she noticed its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was humid, thick with the scent of earth and fertilizer. Shelves held pots of herbs and flowers, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a corner where a small glass vial lay half hidden beneath a sack of soil. She picked it up, noting its label, Atropa belladonna, the same poison Dr. Haydock had mentioned. Her pulse quickened. The vial's presence in the greenhouse, accessible to anyone at the vicarage, suggested the killer had planned carefully. She slipped the vial into her bag, intending to show it to Constable Hurst later. As she stepped outside, she spotted Griselda in the garden, pruning a lavender bush with unsteady hands. Jane, Griselda called, her face brightening. I didn't see you there. Have you found anything new? Miss Marple hesitated, then decided to share a fragment of her discovery. I've learned Mr. Thorne may have been poisoned before he was stabbed. It's a curious puzzle, isn't it? Griselda's eyes widened. Poisoned. Here. But who would? She stopped, her gaze darting to the greenhouse. Leonard's been so odd about that place lately. Keeps saying it's his sanctuary. Won't let me near it. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Leonard's protectiveness over the greenhouse, his locked drawer, his evasiveness about Thorne, they were pieces of a larger picture. Griselda, she said gently, has anyone else been in the greenhouse recently? A gardener, perhaps, or a visitor? Griselda frowned, thinking, not that I know of. But we had a garden party here 2 weeks ago, for the church fund. The village was here, Mrs. Lestrange, Dr. Haydock, even the Grimsbys. I suppose anyone could have slipped in. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. The garden party offered the perfect opportunity for someone to plant the poison, perhaps intending to use it later. You've been most helpful, my dear, she said, patting Griselda's arm. I'll let you get back to your lavender. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the clues. The belladonna vial tied the murder to the vicarage, and Dr. Haydock's knowledge of the poison suggested he was closer to the truth than he admitted. Mrs. Lestrange's locket and stationery pointed to her as a likely suspect, but Leonard's behaviour raised questions. Had he discovered Thorne's attempt to buy silence and acted to protect the vicarage or someone in it? The chapter closed with Miss Marple sitting by her cottage window, the vial and wax stamp on the table before her. The village lay quiet, its secrets buried beneath its tranquil surface. Tomorrow she would revisit the garden party, questioning those who attended. For now, she picked up her knitting, the steady click of her needles a counterpoint to the questions swirling in her mind. The killer had left a trail poison, a dagger, a handkerchief, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it to its end. Chapter 8. The garden party plot. The late morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden haze. The village green, alive with the chatter of sparrows and the distant clatter of a cart. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, walked toward the vicarage, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The belladonna vial from the greenhouse, Dr. Haydock's revelation about Thorne's poisoning, and Mrs. Lestrange's nervous denial of the monogrammed handkerchief swirled in her thoughts. Griselda's mention of the garden party 2 weeks prior, a gathering of half the village afford a new avenue. Someone at that event had access to the greenhouse, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover who. The vicarage garden was quiet, its roses nodding in the breeze. Griselda was inside, sorting linens, her face still pale from the strain of recent days. Miss Marple found her in the dining room, surrounded by tablecloths and napkins. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," Griselda said, managing a weak smile. "I'm trying to keep busy, but it's no use. Every creak in this house makes me jump." "I understand, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. "I've been thinking about your garden party. So many people here, mingling in the garden. It must have been a lively day." Griselda nodded, folding a napkin with care. "Oh, it was. We raised a tidy sum for the church roof. Everyone was here: Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Lestrange, the Grimsbys, Miss Hartnell, even that shy Miss Chandler. Leonard was in his element, charming everyone, though I noticed he kept checking his watch." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And the greenhouse? Did anyone wander that way?" Griselda frowned, thinking, "I didn't see anyone go in, but I was busy serving tea. The greenhouse door was open. The Leonard likes to show off his herbs. I remember Miss Hartnell complaining about the lavender giving her a headache. She was poking around the garden quite a bit." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a sharp tongue and a penchant for gossip, had been at the parish meeting, her indignation over Thorne's presence notable. "Miss Hartnell, you say? Did she seem upset that day?" Griselda tilted her head. "Now that you mention it, she was crosser than usual. Kept muttering about outsiders and troublemakers. I thought she meant the new choir director, but maybe it was Thorne." Thanking Griselda, Miss Marple stepped into the garden, her eyes scanning the path to the greenhouse. The grass was trampled from the party, but a faint trail led to the greenhouse door. She entered, the humid air enveloping her. The belladonna vial's hiding place beneath a sack of soil suggested a hasty concealment. As she examined the shelves, her gaze fell on a gardening glove, its cuff stained with a faint purple residue. She lifted it carefully, noting the scent of belladonna lingering on the fabric. The glove was small, likely a woman's, and its presence confirmed her suspicion. The poison had been handled here, during or after the party. Slipping the glove into her bag, Miss Marple returned to the village, her next stop Miss Hartnell's cottage. The spinster lived in a prim house with lace curtains and a garden of rigid flower beds. Miss Hartnell answered the door, her thin frame swathed in a grey shawl, her eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, I'm in no mood for visitors. This murder business. Has everyone in a tizzy?" "I won't take much of your time," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "I wanted to ask about the garden party. You were there, weren't you? Such a lovely event." Miss Hartnell sniffed, stepping aside. "Lovely until that Thorne man showed up, skulking about like a thief. I told Leonard we shouldn't let strangers in, but he's too soft-hearted." Miss Marple settled into a stiff-backed chair, the parlour smelling of lavender and wax. "I found a gardening glove in the vicarage greenhouse," she said, watching Miss Hartnell closely. "It had a curious stain, like belladonna. You were near the greenhouse that day, weren't you?" Miss Hartnell's face flushed, her hands gripping her shawl. "Are you accusing me, Jane Marple? I'll have you know I lost my glove weeks." ago, someone must have taken it. I was nowhere near that greenhouse. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. Of course, I'm not accusing anyone. But you mentioned Thorn at the party. Did you speak with him? Speak with him, Miss Hartnell's voice rose. I wouldn't give that man the time of day. He was trouble, I knew it from the start. Always whispering with Leonard, acting like he owned the place. She paused, her eyes darting to a small writing desk in the corner. If you must know, I saw him arguing with Mrs. Lestrange by the roses. Looked heated, though I couldn't hear what they said. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another link to Mrs. Lestrange, Clara? Possibly Eliza Warren? How interesting, she said. And did anyone else seem out of sorts that day? Miss Hartnell leaned forward, her voice dropping. Griselda, if you ask me. She was all smiles, but I saw her slip into the greenhouse with a funny look on her face. Probably just checking the flowers, but it struck me odd. Thanking Miss Hartnell, Miss Marple left, her mind buzzing. The gloves stain tied it to the belladonna, and Miss Hartnell's denial was too vehement to dismiss. Yet Griselda's presence in the greenhouse was a new thread, one that complicated the picture. Had Griselda been protecting Leonard, or was she hiding something of her own? As evening fell, Miss Marple attended a village sewing circle at the church hall, knowing it would draw the women of St. Mary Mead. The room was warm, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of needles. Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Chandler, and Mrs. Lestrange were present, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting a cover for her watchful eyes. Such a terrible business with Mr. Thorn, she said, her tone conversational. I heard the garden party was quite the event. Did you all enjoy it? Mrs. Weatherby nodded, her needle pausing. It was grand until the talk turned to Thorn. He was there, you know, hovering near the vicar like a shadow. Miss Chandler, usually quiet, spoke up, her voice trembling. I didn't like him. He stared at Griselda in a way that made my skin crawl. She blushed, her eyes dropping to her stitching. Mrs. Lestrange's needle stilled, her face impassive. He was a stranger, she said coolly. Strangers always stir up trouble. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. Indeed, I found a glove in the greenhouse, stained with something curious. It's odd how things get left behind, isn't it? Mrs. Lestrange's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The conversation shifted, but Miss Marple noted Miss Chandler's flush and Mrs. Lestrange's silence. The garden party had been a crucible, bringing tensions to the surface. The glove's owner was among the villagers, and Miss Marple suspected. It was Miss Hartnell, but she needed proof. The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking home under a starlit sky, the glove and vial in her bag. The garden party had narrowed her focus to a handful of suspects. Miss Hartnell, whose glove and anger pointed to motive. Mrs. Lestrange, whose past tied to Thorns. And Griselda, whose actions in the greenhouse raised questions. Tomorrow, she would confront Miss Hartnell again, testing her story. For now, she paused at her gate, the village's quiet facade masking a killer's intent. Her knitting awaited, each stitch a step toward unraveling the truth. Chapter 9. The Spinsters. Alabitha, early afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, its golden light softening the village's edges but doing little to ease the tension that lingered in the air. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat firmly in place, walked toward Miss Hartnell's cottage, her knitting bag a familiar companion, the stained gardening glove, the belladonna vial, and Miss Hartnell's vehement denial at their last meeting weighed heavily on her mind. The garden party had revealed a web of connections: Mrs. Lestrange's heated exchange with Thorn, Griselda's curious visit to the greenhouse, and Miss Hartnell's pointed anger. Today, Miss Marple aimed to test the spinster story, certain that the glove's purple stain was no coincidence. Miss Hartnell's cottage stood prim and unyielding, its flower beds as rigid as its owner's demeanour. The door opened before Miss Marple could knock, revealing Miss Hartnell in a starched apron, her thin lips pursed. "Miss Marple back again," she said, her voice sharp. "I've nothing more to say about that dreadful business." "I shan't take long," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I've been thinking about the garden party, and your glove in the greenhouse. It's such a puzzle, isn't it? A glove lost, yet found with a stain like belladonna." Miss Hartnell's eyes narrowed, her hands gripping the doorframe. "I told you that glove was stolen. I haven't been near the Vicarage greenhouse in weeks." "You're barking up the wrong tree, Jane Marple." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her gaze was steady. "Of course, I believe you, but I wonder if you might have seen something that dazed someone near the greenhouse, perhaps who could have taken it." Miss Hartnell hesitated, her fingers twitching. "I was busy with the cake stall," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But I did see that Mrs. Lestrange wandering about, sniffing the roses like she owned the place, and Griselda flitting in and out of the greenhouse. I thought she was fetching herbs for the tea, but she looked furtive." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. Griselda's presence in the greenhouse, noted by both Miss Hartnell and herself, was troubling. But the spinster's quick deflection to others raised her suspicions. "And Mr. Thorn," she pressed, "you mentioned he was trouble. Did you ever have cause to speak with him directly?" Miss Hartnell's face reddened. "Speak with him? Never. He was a scoundrel, I could tell, always lurking, whispering with the vicar. I wouldn't be surprised if he was blackmailing someone." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Motive that fit the threatening letter fragment and Thorn's nervous demeanour. "Blackmail is a serious charge," she said softly. "Did you hear anything to suggest it?" Miss Hartnell's eyes darted to her writing desk, a sturdy oak piece in the corner of her parlour. "Nothing specific," she muttered, "just a feeling. Men like Thorn always have secrets." Sensing an opportunity, Miss Marple shifted tack. "Your desk is lovely," she said, her tone admiring. "Do you write many letters?" "I noticed Mr. Thorn received some in a fine hand, much like yours." The spinster's face paled, and she stepped in front of the desk, her shawl slipping. "I write to my sister in Devon, that's all. Nothing to do with Thorn." Her voice was shrill, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands. "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising. "I won't keep you. Thank you for your time." As she stepped outside, she glanced back, catching Miss Hartnell's hurried movement toward the desk. The spinster's reaction to the letters was telling, and Miss Marple resolved to investigate further. Her next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Weatherby, ever eager for gossip, might have overheard something about Miss Hartnell. The shop smelled of fresh bread and polished wood, its shelves lined with jars of sweets and tins of tea. Mrs. Weatherby was behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, what a day," she said, waving her in. "The whole village is talking about Thorn. They say he was poisoned before the dagger got him." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "News travelled fast in St. Mary Mead. "So I've heard," she said. "I was just speaking with Miss Hartnell about the garden party. She seems quite upset about Mr. Thorn." Mrs. Weatherby leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, she's been in a state for weeks. Came in here ranting about outsiders, ruining the village. I heard her say Thorn reminded her of someone who cheated her years ago. Something about a bad investment." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the Grimsby's loss in the 1918 scandal. Could Miss Hartnell have been another victim of Thorn's fraud as Reginald Harcourt? "How interesting," she said. "Did she mention any correspondence with him?" "Not directly," Mrs. Weatherby said, lowering her voice. "But I saw her posting a letter the day before the murder. Cream envelope, fancy writing, looked like the ones Thorn got, if you ask me." The confirmation sent a thrill through Miss Marple. The letters, the glove, Miss Hartnell's anger, they were aligning too neatly to be coincidence. Thanking Mrs. Weatherby, she left the shop and headed toward the churchyard, where she often found clarity among the quiet graves. As she walked, she recalled Miss Hartnell's desk, its locked drawer barely concealed by her shawl. A search might reveal the truth, but she needed a way in. Her chance came that evening at the village hall, where a charity auction was being held to raise funds for the church roof. Miss Hartnell was there, her grey shawl draped over a chair, as she bid fiercely on a set of china teacups. Miss Marple, seated nearby, watched as the spinster excused herself to fetch a glass of water. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple slipped out, citing a need for fresh air, and hurried to Miss Hartnell's cottage. The door was unlocked, a common habit in St. Mary Mead. Inside, the parlour was, as she remembered, the desk beckoning, with a glance. At the window to ensure no one approached, Miss Marple opened the drawer, revealing a stack of cream envelopes, each bearing the same looping script as Thorn's letters. One, half-written, read, "Reginald, you cannot hide forever. Pay what you owe, or I'll tell the village everything." The signature was absent, but the intent was clear. Dash blackmail. Miss Marple's pulse raced. Miss Hartnell had been writing to Thorn, likely threatening to expose his past as Harcourt. But had she gone further? The glove suggested she handled the belladonna, but the dagger's precision pointed to a different hand. Closing the drawer, Miss Marple left the cottage, her mind racing. Returning to the auction, she found Miss Hartnell back at her seat, her face flushed from bidding. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Miss Hartnell, I've been thinking about your glove. If it was stolen, perhaps the thief left it in the greenhouse to cast suspicion. Have you any enemies who might do such a thing?" Miss Hartnell's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Enemies? No, but I wouldn't put it past that Mrs. Lestrange. She's got a sly look, always whispering with Dr. Haydock." Her voice dripped with disdain, but Miss Marple noted the deflection. The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking home under a moonlit sky, the letter's threat echoing in her mind. Miss Hartnell's blackmail was a motive, but her alibi at the cake stall during the party needed checking. The glove tied her to the poison, yet the dagger suggested another hand, perhaps Mrs. Lestrange, or even Griselda. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would verify Miss Hartnell's movements at the party, perhaps by speaking with Miss Chandler, who had been nearby. For now, she clutched her knitting bag, the village's secrets unraveling with each step she took toward the truth. Chapter 10. The Midnight Confession. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silver glow across the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting idle as she sifted through the clues that had piled up. Like autumn leaves, Miss Hartnell's blackmailing letters, the belladonna-stained glove, the locket with E.W., and the photograph tying Mrs. Lestrange to Thorn's past. The garden party had been a turning point, a moment when motives and opportunities collided. But Miss Hartnell's vehement denial and Griselda's anxious hints about Leonard's behaviour kept Miss Marple's thoughts circling back to the vicarage. Tonight she would seek out Griselda, hoping the vicar's wife might reveal more in the stillness of the evening. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage just as the church clock struck 10, its chimes echoing through the empty streets. Griselda answered the door in her dressing gown, her auburn curls loose, her eyes red-rimmed. "Jane, it's late," she said, her voice trembling. "Is something wrong?" "I couldn't sleep, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle, "and I thought you might need a friend. This business with Mr. Thorne has us all on edge." She stepped inside, noting the dim light in the drawing-room and the faint sound of pacing from upstairs. Griselda led her to the sofa, where a half-empty teapot sat on a tray. "I'm at my wit's end," she confessed, sinking into a chair. "Leonard's been like a ghost since the murder. He locks himself in his study, won't talk to me. I heard him muttering last night, something about a moral debt. It's driving me mad, Jane." Miss Marple's heart quickened. A moral debt echoes of Thorne's offer to make amends through a donation. "Did you hear anything else?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. "Perhaps about Mr. Thorne's visits?" Griselda's hands twisted in her lap. "I shouldn't say, but the morning of the murder, I overheard them in the study. Leonard was angry, telling Thorne he couldn't buy forgiveness. Thorne said something about keeping her quiet, and then it got quiet, like they knew I was near." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think much of it then, but now. Jane, what if Leonard's mixed up in this?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. There, my dear. Leonard's a good man, but good men can carry burdens. Let's see if we can lighten his." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I found something in Miss Hartnell's cottage letters threatening to expose Thorne's past. Do you know if she ever spoke to Leonard about him?" Griselda frowned, wiping her eyes. "Miss Hartnell, she's always complaining about something, but I don't think so. She did give Leonard a letter at the garden party, though said it was for the church fund. I thought it odd, her being so secretive." "About it?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A letter at the party, could it have been another of Miss Hartnell's threats, misdirected to Leonard? "And did Leonard keep it?" she asked. "I don't know," Griselda said. "He's been so secretive, locking everything in his desk." She glanced toward the study door, her voice dropping. "He's in there now, going through papers. He thinks I'm asleep." Miss Marple rose, her expression calm but resolute. "Perhaps I should have a word with him. Alone, if you don't mind." Griselda nodded, her face a mix of hope and fear. The study door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling into the hall. Miss Marple knocked softly and entered, finding Leonard hunched over his desk, a pile of papers before him. His face was haggard, his clerical collar loosened. "Miss Marple," he said, startled. "It's late. What brings you here?" "I've been speaking with Griselda," she said, settling into a chair. "She's worried about you, Leonard. And I must confess, so am I. You've been carrying something heavy since Mr. Thorne's death. Perhaps it's time to share it." Leonard's hands stilled on the papers, his eyes avoiding hers. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered. "This is a difficult time, that's all." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "I found a photograph in your drawer, Leonard Thorne, with a woman, and Griselda overheard you arguing with him about a moral debt. Then there's the letter Miss Hartnell gave you at the garden party. These things suggest you knew more about Thorn than you've let on." Leonard's face crumpled, and he sank back in his chair. "You don't understand, Jane. I was trying to protect someone." He paused, his voice barely a whisper. "Griselda." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but she kept her expression serene. "Protect her? How so?" Leonard rubbed his temples, his voice hoarse. "Thorn came to me weeks ago, offering money for the church. Large sums, anonymous. I thought it was guilt, maybe from his past. But that morning, he admitted he'd been involved with Griselda years ago, before we married. Nothing serious, he said, but he was threatening to tell the village, to ruin her reputation unless I helped him hide his identity. He said someone was after him, someone who knew him as Harcourt." Miss Marple's mind raced. Griselda tied to Thorn's past. It explained Leonard's tension, his locked drawer, his curtness. "And the letter from Miss Hartnell?" she asked. Leonard pulled a crumpled envelope from the pile, its cream paper and looping script unmistakable. "She gave it to me at the party, said it was urgent. It was a threat to Thorn, demanding he pay her for her silence about his fraud. I didn't know what to do. I hid it, hoping to avoid a scandal." Miss Marple took the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Reginald, you owe me for what you took. Pay, or the village will know." Miss Hartnell's blackmail was confirmed, but Leonard's confession opened a new door. "Did you confront Thorn about this?" she asked. "I did," Leonard admitted. "That morning I told him to leave Griselda alone, that his money wasn't worth her honor. He laughed, said I was naive. Then he left, and hours later he was dead." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts aligning. Leonard's motive was clear, protecting Griselda, but his story suggested he wasn't the killer. The dagger's precision and the belladonna pointed to a colder hand. "Thank you, Leonard," she said. "You've done the right thing. I'll keep this discreet." As she left the study, Griselda was waiting, her eyes wide. "Is he all right, Jane?" "He will be," Miss Marple said, patting her arm. "But we must be careful. Someone wanted Thorn silenced, and they're still among us." The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking home under the starry sky, the letter in her bag. Leonard's confession had clarified Thorn's blackmail threat, but it also implicated Griselda in a way she hadn't expected. Miss Hartnell's letters were damning, yet the poison and dagger suggested another player, perhaps Mrs. Lestrange, whose locket and stationery remained suspicious. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would decode a new clue, a coded diary she'd glimpsed in Thorn's cottage during a police visit. For now, she clutched her knitting bag, the village's secrets tightening like a noose around the killer's identity. Chapter 11. A dangerous liaison. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a veil of silver as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Rose Cottage, the late Reginald Thorn's home. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, but her thoughts were sharp. Slicing through the tangle of clues, Leonard's confession about Griselda's past with Thorn, Miss Hartnell's blackmailing letters, the belladonna-stained glove, and the locket with E.W. that pointed to Mrs. Lestrange as Eliza Warren. The coded diary she'd glimpsed in Thorn's cottage during a police visit beckoned, promising answers to the questions swirling around his murder. Today, Miss Marple would unravel its secrets and confront Mrs. Lestrange, whose guarded demeanor and elegant stationery made her a central figure in the mystery. Rose Cottage stood at the village's edge, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of ivy. Constable Hurst had left it unlocked, trusting the village's quiet reputation, and Miss Marple slipped inside, her steps silent on the worn floorboards. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old tobacco. Thorne's belongings were sparse: a few books, a cracked teacup, and a small desk cluttered with papers. Her eyes landed on the diary, a leather-bound volume tucked beneath a stack of bills. Its pages were filled with cryptic symbols, letters, and numbers in a jagged hand. Unlike the looping script of the blackmail letters, Miss Marple sat at the desk, her gloved fingers tracing the entries. After an hour of patient study, she recognized a simple substitution cipher, one she'd seen in her nephew's puzzle books. Deciphering a few lines, she read, "E.W. demands payment. Knows too much. Must meet at Vicarage, dusk." Her heart quickened. E.W. Eliza Warren. Surely Mrs. Lestrange. The diary confirmed a planned meeting, likely the one that ended in Thorne's death. But why the vicarage? And had Mrs. Lestrange wielded the dagger, or was she another victim of Thorne's schemes? Pocketing the diary, Miss Marple headed for Mrs. Lestrange's cottage, her mind racing. The village was stirring, with villagers exchanging hushed words about the murder. As she approached the cottage, she noticed the curtains drawn tight, a sign of retreat. She knocked, and Mrs. Lestrange opened the door, her face pale, her silk blouse replaced by a plain dress. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight, "I'm not feeling well today. Perhaps another time." "This won't take long," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I've found something that concerns you, a diary, mentioning a meeting with Mr. Thorne, and your locket, with E.W. engraved, suggests you knew him better than you've let on." Mrs. Lestrange's hand flew to her throat, where the locket hung. She stepped back, her eyes darting. "You've been prying, haven't you? Very well, come in." The parlour was as elegant as before, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. Mrs. Lestrange sank onto the settee, her composure fraying. "What do you want to know?" Miss Marple settled opposite her, her knitting bag at her feet. "The truth, Mrs. Lestrange, should I say Eliza Warren. You were Thorne's partner in the 1918 fraud, weren't you? And you came here to confront him." Mrs. Lestrange's eyes widened, then softened with resignation. "You're cleverer than you look, Miss Marple. Yes, I was Eliza Warren. Reginald and I ran a scheme in London, skimming funds from a charity, Trust. When it collapsed, he fled, taking most of the money. I came to St. Mary Mead to find him, to demand my share. He owed me, and I wasn't going to let him hide." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "And the letters? Were they yours?" "No," Mrs. Lestrange said, her voice firm. "I wrote to him, yes, but not those threats. Mine were personal, asking for what was mine. I met him at the vicarage that evening, as we'd agreed, but he was alive when I left. He laughed at me, said I'd never see a penny. I was angry, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the locket?" "It matches the one in a photograph I found in Leonard's study." Mrs. Lestrange's fingers brushed the locket. "Reginald gave it to me years ago, before everything went wrong. Kept it as a reminder of what he took from me. I didn't know he had a photo of us." Her voice cracked, revealing a flicker of pain. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft. "Did you see anyone else that evening, near the vicarage? Someone who might have followed you?" Mrs. Lestrange frowned, thinking, "There was a shadow by the gate as I left, a man, I think, in a dark coat. I didn't see his face, but he moved quickly, like he didn't want to be seen. The description matched the figure Polly had seen arguing with Thorn at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple's mind raced another player, perhaps the killer. "Thank you, Clara," she said, using the name deliberately. "You've been most helpful." As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Thorn's cottage again. The diary had confirmed Mrs. Lestrange's meeting, but her denial of the threatening letters pointed back to Miss Hartnell. The man in the dark coat was a new thread, one that suggested an outside force, determined to tie these clues together. She returned to Rose Cottage, this time with Constable Hurst's permission to search further. Inside, she found a hidden panel behind the desk, revealed by a loose floorboard. Within was a small safe, its lock scratched as if recently forced. Inside lay documents ledgers detailing the 1918 fraud with names of investors, including the Grimsbys and, surprisingly, Leonard Clement. The vicar had invested a small sum, likely parish funds, and lost it when Thorn vanished. The discovery explained Leonard's protectiveness over Griselda and his reluctance to speak. Had he confronted Thorn or helped cover up his past? Miss Marple tucked the ledgers into her bag, her heart pounding. The safe's forced lock suggested someone else had been here, perhaps the man in the dark coat. As she left the cottage, she spotted a glint in the gardener, broken cufflink, its silver edge etched with a serpent design. It was too fine for a villager, hinting at someone with means. Perhaps the shadowy figure. The chapter closed with Miss Marple standing by her cottage gate, the ledgers and cufflink in her bag. Mrs. Lestrange's confession had clarified her role, but the threatening letters and poison pointed to Miss Hartnell, while the cufflink and ledgers suggested a third party. Tomorrow she would set a trap to lure the man in the dark coat, perhaps by spreading word of the ledger's discovery. For now she gazed at the quiet village, its secrets unraveling like a skein of wool, each thread bringing her closer to the killer's identity. Chapter 12. The trap is sprung. The late afternoon sky over St. Mary Mead was streaked with clouds, casting a dappled light across the village's winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles idle as she studied the serpent-etched cufflink, the ledgers from Thorn's safe, and the coded diary's cryptic entries, Mrs. Lestrange's confession as Eliza Warren, Miss Hartnell's blackmail letters, and Leonard's admission about Griselda's past with Thorn, had tightened the web of motives, but the man in the dark coat seen by Polly and Mrs. Lestrange remained a shadow. Today, Miss Marple would set a trap to draw him out, using the ledgers as bait to flush the killer from hiding. She began at the Blue Boar, where gossip spread faster than wildfire. Polly, the barmaid, was wiping down tables, her freckled face brightening at Miss Marple's arrival. "Miss Marple here for a cuppa?" she asked, setting down her cloth. "Perhaps later," Miss Marple replied, her tone conspiratorial. "Polly, I've found something curious at Thorn's cottage ledgers, detailing his old fraud. They name names, important ones. I'm taking them to Constable Hurst this evening, but I thought you might know who's been asking about Thorn." Polly's eyes widened. "Ledgers, that's big news. I haven't heard much, but I'll keep my ears open. That man in the dark coat hasn't been back, but I'll let you know if he shows." Miss Marple nodded, knowing the rumour would spread by dusk. She next visited Mrs. Weatherby at the shop, casually mentioning the ledgers while buying a tin of biscuits. "I do hope they help the police," she said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "Such secrets could stir up trouble if they fell into the wrong hands." By mid-afternoon, the village hummed with the news. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, where Griselda was arranging flowers, her hands steadier than before. "Jane, you're everywhere today," she said, managing a smile. "Any news on, I'm getting closer," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Griselda, I need your help. I've let slip about some ledgers I found, and I suspect someone will try to retrieve them tonight. Could you watch the vicarage garden after dark? Don't interfere, just note who comes. Near?" Griselda's face paled, but she nodded. "I can do that. Leonard's at a parish meeting till late, so I'll be alone. Oh, Jane, be careful." Miss Marple patted her arm. "I always am, my dear." Her plan was simple: hide near Thorn's cottage, where she'd left a decoyer-locked box resembling the safe visible through the window. The real ledgers were safe in her cottage, but the bait might lure the man in the dark coat as night fell. Miss Marple positioned herself behind a yew tree across from Rose Cottage, her dark shawl blending with the shadows. The village was silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl. At 9:30, a figure emerged from the line, a man, tall, in a dark coat and hat pulled low. He moved with purpose, glancing around before approaching the cottage. Miss Marple's heart quickened as he tested the door, then slipped inside through a side window. She crept closer, peering through the parlor window. The man was at the desk, prying open the decoy box with a small tool. The lamplight caught his face, and Miss Marple stifled a gasp. It was Dr. Haydock. His hands shook as he rifled through the box, finding only blank papers. He cursed under his breath, his face a mask of frustration. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind racing. Dr. Haydock, the man in the dark coat, had been watching Thorn, arguing with him, and now searching for the ledgers. Had he poisoned Thorn, then resorted to the dagger when the first attempt failed? She needed answers. Slipping away, she hurried to the surgery, knowing he'd return there. The surgery was dark, but a light flickered in the back room. Miss Marple knocked, her voice firm. "Dr. Haydock, it's Jane Marple. We need to talk." The door opened, and Dr. Haydock's face was pale, his eyes wary. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here at this hour?" "I saw you at Thorn's cottage," she said, stepping inside. "You were looking for the ledgers. I think it's time you told me why." Dr. Haydock's shoulders slumped, and he gestured to a chair. "You're too clever, Jane. I should have known you'd catch me." He sank into his own chair, rubbing his face. "I didn't kill Thorn, but I supplied the belladonna. He came to me, desperate, said someone was poisoning him. I gave him the antidote, but also a small dose of belladonna, thinking I could control the situation, scare him into leaving. He was ruining Liv's Clara's, the Grimsby's, even Leonard's." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And the ledgers, why seek them?" "They name me," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Invested in Thorn's scheme years ago, lost everything. When Clarielissa told me he was here, I confronted him. He laughed, said he'd expose us both. I couldn't let that happen." "And the dagger?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice steady. "Not me," Dr. Haydock said, his eyes meeting hers. "I swear it. The poison was my mistake, but the dagger, that was someone else's rage." Miss Marple nodded, her mind aligning the pieces. Dr. Haydock's confession explained the poison and his secrecy, but the dagger's precision pointed to a personal motive, not financial. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, rising. "You've made things clearer." As she left, she met Griselda in the lane, who had been watching the vicarage. "Jane, I saw someone in the garden," Griselda whispered. "A woman, near the greenhouse. I couldn't see who, but she was quick, like she knew the place." The chapter closed with Miss Marple walking home, the night air cool against her face. Dr. Haydock's admission had ruled him out as the killer, but his role in the poisoning tightened the web around Mrs. Lestrange and Miss Hartnell, the woman. In the garden, possibly Griselda herself, or another suggested a crime of passion, not greed. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would confront the vicar's wife, probing her movements that night. For now, she clutched her knitting bag, the village's. Secrets unraveling like a skein of yarn, each twist bringing her closer to the truth. Chapter 13. The vicar's redemption. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle blush, painting the village in soft hues of pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple sat at her cottage table, her tea untouched as she sifted through the intricate web of clues: Dr. Haydock's confession about supplying the belladonna, the serpent-edged cufflink, Miss Hartnell's blackmail letters, and Mrs. Lestrange's identity as Eliza Warren. Griselda's sighting of a woman in the vicarage garden last night had added a new thread, one that pointed to a crime driven by emotion rather than greed. Today, Miss Marple would confront Leonard and Griselda, certain that the vicar's protectiveness and his wife's anxiety held the final key to Thorne's murder. The vicarage was quiet as Miss Marple approached, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the morning sun. The roses in the garden drooped slightly, their petals scattered like silent witnesses. Griselda answered her knock, her face pale but composed, her hands clutching a dishcloth. "Jane, you're early," she said, her voice tight. "Leonard's in the study, but he's not himself." "I need to speak with you both," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "This business with Mr. Thorne is coming to a head, and I believe you both know more than you've shared." Griselda's eyes widened, but she nodded, leading Miss Marple to the drawing room. Leonard stood by the window, his clerical collar askew, his hands clasped tightly. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice weary, "I've told you everything, Thorns. Threats Griselda's past. What more do you want?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "The truth, Leonard, about what happened the night Thorne died. Griselda saw a woman in the garden last night, near the greenhouse, and I've learned Dr. Haydock tried to poison Thorne, though he didn't wield the dagger. Someone else did. Someone with a personal motive." Griselda gasped, her dishcloth falling to the floor. "A woman, Jane? You can't think it was me?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "I don't, my dear, but I need to understand your movements that evening. And Leonard, I need to know why you've been so guarded about the greenhouse." Leonard's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair. "You're right, Jane. I've been hiding something, but not what you think." He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. Griselda had a youthful indiscretion with Thorne years ago, before we met. He came here threatening to expose it, to ruin her in the village. I confronted him that morning, told him to leave her alone, but I swear I didn't kill him. Griselda's eyes filled with tears. "It's true, Jane. I was young, foolish. Thorne was charming then, nothing like the man he became. When definitive edition, when he came to St. Mary Mead, he tried to blackmail me, but I told Leonard to ignore him. I thought it was settled." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "And the greenhouse, Leonard? Why protect it so fiercely?" Leonard hesitated, his voice low. "I found the belladonna vial after the garden party. I thought Griselda might have put it there to scare Thorn off. I hid it, to protect her. But I didn't know about the poison until Dr. Haydock mentioned it. Griselda's hand flew to her mouth. You thought I poisoned him, Leonard. How could you? I was afraid, he admitted, his voice breaking. You were so upset about. Him and I found you in the greenhouse that day. I didn't know what to think. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The pieces were falling into place, but the dagger's precision and the woman in the garden suggested another hand. Griselda, she said gently, were you in the garden the evening Thorn died? No, Griselda said, her voice firm. I was in the kitchen, preparing supper. Leonard was pruning roses. I never went near the study. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the knitting bag, where the serpent-etched cufflink rested. Dr. Haydock had admitted to the poison, but the cufflink wasn't his style, too ornate. Her thoughts turned to Miss Chandler, Griselda's loyal friend, who had blushed at the sewing circle when Thorn's name was mentioned. Griselda was Miss Chandler at the vicarage that evening. Griselda frowned. She stopped by to drop off some mending. She was only here a moment, then left. Why? Miss Marple's mind aligned the clues. Miss Chandler's protectiveness over Griselda, her presence at the garden party, her flushed reaction. Could she have learned of Thorn's blackmail and acted to protect her friend? I need to speak with her, Miss Marple said, rising. She may have seen something. Miss Chandler lived in a small cottage near the church, its windows adorned with cheery curtains. She answered the door, her quiet demeanour tinged with nervousness. Miss Marple, what a surprise, she said, her hands twisting a handkerchief knot. Monogrammed, Miss Marple noted. I've been piecing together Mr. Thorn's death, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. The parlour was cosy, filled with embroidered cushions. You were at the vicarage the evening he died. Did you see anything unusual? Miss Chandler's face paled, her eyes darting to a small box on the mantel. I didn't stay long. I just dropped off some mending for Griselda. Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. I found a cufflink near Thorn's cottage. Miss Marple said, producing it. It's quite distinctive. Have you seen it before? Miss Chandler's breath caught, and she sank onto a chair, her hands covering her face. It was my father's, she whispered. I couldn't let him hurt Griselda again. He was blackmailing her, threatening to ruin her. I went to the vicarage to talk to him, to beg him to stop. He laughed, said she deserved it. I lost control, grabbed the dagger from the desk. It was over before I knew it. Miss Marple's heart sank, but her voice was gentle. You protected your friend, didn't you? Miss Chandler nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. Griselda's been so kind to me, and he was going to destroy her. Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder. You must tell the police, my dear. The truth will come out, and it's better they hear it from you. The chapter closed with Miss Marple accompanying Miss Chandler to the police station, where Constable Hurst listened to her tearful confession. The village buzzed with shock, but Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The dagger's precision, the cufflink, Miss Chandler's loyalty, it all fit. As she walked home, the weight of the truth settled over her, tempered by the knowledge that justice would prevail. Tomorrow she would help Griselda and Leonard heal. For now, she gazed at the starlit village, its peace restored, if only for a moment. Chapter 14. Peace restored. The soft light of a late summer afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow. The villages, cottages, and gardens serene under a sky brushed with wisps of cloud. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a delicate shawl, the weight of the past week's revelations settling into a quiet resolve. Miss Chandler's tearful confession had unraveled the mystery of Reginald Thorne's murder, tying together the threads of the belladonna vial, the serpent-etched cufflink, and the blackmail letters. The village was still reeling, but a sense of closure hung in the air, fragile yet hopeful. Today, Miss Marple would visit the vicarage one last time, to help Griselda and Leonard find their way forward. The vicarage garden was in full bloom, its roses vibrant despite the turmoil that had unfolded within its walls. Griselda greeted Miss Marple at the gate, her auburn curls tied back, her smile tentative but warm. "Jane, you're a blessing," she said, embracing her. "I don't know how we'd have managed without you. Come in, Leonard's making tea." Inside, the drawing room was brighter than Miss Marple had seen it in weeks, the curtains thrown open to let in the sun. Leonard stood by the tea tray, his clerical collar neatly fastened, his face less haggard than before. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady, "we owe you everything. You've brought light to a dark time." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Nonsense, Leonard. I only followed the truth where it led." Miss Chandler's confession was a heavy blow, but it's better to face it than let secrets fester. Griselda's eyes glistened as she poured tea. "Poor Mary," she said softly. "She only wanted to protect me. I never dreamed she'd go so far. If I'd told her about Thorne's threats, maybe—" Miss Marple's hand rested on hers. "You couldn't have known, my dear. Mary acted out of love, misguided though it was. She faced justice, but her heart was in the right place." Leonard sat beside his wife, his hand finding hers. "I should have been stronger," he said, his voice low. "I hid Thorne's photograph, kept his secrets, thinking I was shielding Griselda. Instead, I let things spiral." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "We all make mistakes, Leonard. What matters is how you move forward. The village needs you both, now more than ever." As they sipped tea, the conversation turned to healing. The church was planning a memorial service for Thorne, a gesture to acknowledge the tragedy and unite the community. Miss Marple suggested a charity fund in his name, using the donation he'd offered a way to turn his tainted past into something good. Griselda's face brightened at the idea, and Leonard nodded, a spark of purpose in his eyes. Later, Miss Marple walked to the village green, where preparations for the memorial were underway. Villagers bustled about, hanging wreaths and setting out chairs. Mrs. Weatherby waved her over, her apron dusted with flour. "Miss Marple, you've done wonders," she said. "I never thought Mary Chandler had it in her, but I suppose loyalty can drive us to strange places." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her gaze sweeping the green. She spotted Mrs. Lestrange Clara, now openly Eliza Warren helping arrange flowers. Their eyes met, and Mrs. Lestrange approached, her silk scarf replaced by a simple shawl. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady. "I'm staying in St. Mary Mead. I've told the police everything my past with Reginald, the fraud. I want to start fresh, make amends." Miss Marple's smile was warm. "That's a brave choice. Clara, the village will come to see you for who you are now, not who you were." She paused, noting the locket still at Clara's throat. "Keep that locket. It's a reminder of lessons learned." As the memorial began, the church bell tolled, its mournful notes echoing across the village. Leonard spoke eloquently, acknowledging Thorne's flaws but calling for forgiveness and unity. Griselda stood beside him, her hand in his, their bond visibly strengthened. Miss Marple sat in the back, her knitting in her lap, her heart lightened by the sight of a community beginning to heal. The service ended with a quiet hymn, and as villagers dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the churchyard's ancient yews. Dr. Haydock approached, his face sombre. "Jane, I've turned over the belladonna records to the police," he said. "I'll face what comes for my part in this. Thank you for keeping my secret until I was ready." "You did the right thing," Miss Marple said gently. "The truth always finds its way out." That evening, Miss Marple invited Clara for tea at her cottage, a gesture to welcome her into the village's fold. They sat by the fire, the air warm with the scent of scones and chamomile. Clara spoke of her plans to teach music to the village children, a small step toward redemption. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, her heart content that Mary Mead would embrace her in time. The chapter closed with Miss Marple alone by her fire, her shawl nearly complete. The village was quiet, its secrets laid bare, its wounds beginning to mend. The belladonna, the dagger, the letters all had led to Miss Chandler's desperate act, driven by loyalty to Griselda. As Miss Marple knitted her final stitches, she reflected on human nature, its capacity for harm, but also for healing. She set her needles aside, the shawl a soft heap in her lap, and gazed out at the starlit village. Peace had returned to Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had ensured its restoration. The case was closed, the truth revealed, and her cottage was once again a haven of calm.